Welcome to the Tier 2 Readiness module for teams that will be going through our Tier 2 systems training with Florida PBS. The purpose of this module is to help teams feel prepared that they know what people are appropriate to attend the training, what data they need to bring and other materials, and that they feel comfortable completing the readiness checklist that you probably have a copy of given by your district coordinator. One of the first questions we usually get is, what else do I need to bring to training or be prepared to have in training? A computer or device to access not only our Florida PBS system that you see on the screen right now, but also your own data systems within the district would be extremely helpful. With that, we want to make sure you have your username and password. If for some chance you have forgotten or don't know how to access your username or password for our Florida PBS system, you may get that information from your district coordinator. We also would like to have you bring a laptop so that you can access your own district data systems. Depending upon how many you have in the district, sometimes there's multiple systems that you want behavioral or academic data from, early warning systems data from, any data that you use in your team's problem solving. So we want to make sure, again, that you have that technology that you can access it. Paper copies of that type of data are okay to bring. Some people prefer to access it live on the full reports so that you have that technology and that you have your username and password for any of your district data systems are very important for setting you up for success for the training. This training will be covering development of your Tier 2 system on your school campus. So an important feature of this is that we're going to be revisiting, as part of Tier 2, we're going to be revisiting the successfulness or the health or establishment, how healthy your foundation is in Tier 1 systems as part of this training. Tier 2 is meant to supplement Tier 1 in order to remediate difficulties that are identified, but also prevent problems from intensifying or getting worse to where they're needing Tier 3 supports. So it provides that continuum in our multi-tiered system of supplementing Tier 1 and preventing the need for Tier 3. Even students who receive Tier 3 support still receive Tier 2 and Tier 1 as part of that intensification of a multi-tiered system. But the focus will be on development of that Tier 2 piece of the continuum. You'll have an opportunity to hear about best practices and learn about best practices as part of setting up that system. Some of those practices will be modeled and tools will be provided for your team. You will also have a time with your team to plan or apply some of the things that you're learning to your own Tier 2 system during training. One of the important things that you do have with you to make your team planning time and team application time really valuable is the right kinds of data. So when we're speaking of data that helps us in Tier 2 system, we're looking for data sets that will help us not only identify students who are at risk, but data sets that also might help us know how the health of our core is. So for example, in discipline referral data, we often have reports that show how many kids, what percentage of our student population is getting 0 to 1 referrals, 2 to 5 referrals, or 6 or more referrals as part of our PBS core report. That's one type of data that shows how successful our core is in terms of kids getting referrals, but also might be a way to start to identify kids that might need more supports. We're going to use data in every activity as a part of this training. So bringing your own school data will, again, help you use that planning time more effectively during those activity times. And you'll also have a time to apply the learning that you're having to your real life system. So some other data sources on the right for you, and I mentioned the type of data broadly that you want. Discipline referral data or that minor incident. If you're a campus that looks at minor incident tracking and not just that of referrals, that's data to bring. Any other outcome data sources that you look at as a school leadership team for Tier 1, but also use to identify kids that might be at risk, like attendance data, academic data, nominations we'll talk about in a second, and even self-referral data. Any of that type of data that you use to start signifying or giving red flags that kids are at risk. And bringing those reports, or again, having access to the reports during the activities, will be extremely helpful. The other bullet there that you'll see, the request for problem-solving team, sometimes it's helpful to see how many requests are coming for individual kids to your problem-solving teams as another source of data. And I know that might be raw, messy data where you're just looking at, again, team lists or team agendas of how many kids have come to that problem-solving team on a campus, but it's another source that we look at. And nomination forms are a format of systemically nominating kids as a way of screening. So we have a grade level or department start that we have a classrooms within a grade level or classrooms within a department start to nominate their top 3 externalizers and top 3 internalizers, and then come to the grade level or department to screen who are our top priorities for those externalizing and internalizing. And we'll cover that practice during training. I'm just giving you a little bit of background here so that if you have something like that, that you can bring that information to training. If you don't, then you will learn about it at training. And then self-referrals is on there because especially with our adolescents, if you're a secondary team, we know self-referrals for intervention or for assistance is often very accurate. So where do we start for this training? A team is formed. And one of the first things on your readiness checklist is talking about who's a member of your team, because that's the folks that we want to come to training. That's the people that we want for the focus of this content. The team is going to go through examining a little bit of how's our core, our foundation of our school-wide PBS system going, and that's our core instruction and core environment that kids have access to before we're referring them for Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports. You're going to have a chance, like I mentioned in some of your team activities, to examine what you already have in place, because almost every school has something in place for Tier 2 supports or systems, but you'll get to go through some of those bullets in terms of what's going really well and successful versus things you might want to improve or fix based on what you learn in the training. So how your team functions, what process and procedures they use, the interventions that are on your campus, and how data is used to match those interventions to needs, along with progress monitoring that they are working or not working to make decisions from that. A lot of times people ask, what team is this? And so we want you to think logically, is there already an existing team on your campus that looks at problem solving for student needs? A big word of advice from us that will make you successful is there should be a subset on this group, or that might be the whole group that comes. Also overlaps with your Tier 1 PBIS or MTSS leadership team, so that there's communication between those two groups. And they know what's happening in the Tier 1 system as they're referring and monitoring or coordinating in the Tier 2 intervention system. So we ask you to consider, are there logical members that already meet for this purpose? They may meet on just individual students right now. Sometimes that's what happens. And when we come to training, we improve that system a little bit more to be systemically looking at Tier 2 along with individual needs at Tier 3. But we want you to think about what makes sense on your campus. And a lot of times that's existing problem-solving teams that may, again, only problem-solve individuals, but those are the folks that we want to come to this training. Most importantly, there's that overlap, though, with that Tier 1 school-based leadership team. And ideally, if you're having the Tier 1 leadership subset that comes, these are folks also that are well-versed in the individual problem-solving, or at least 1 or 2 people there. And teaming and roles in these next couple slides. So the Tier 2 team or subset of that larger leadership team at Tier 1, this is the responsibilities that make this team successful and what we'll talk a lot about in training of how to implement these responsibilities. So this team is responsible for systemically looking at who might need supplemental supports for Tier 2. And we do that systemically, so across a grade level, across a school, versus kid by kid by kid at this level of the continuum. And a lot of the content is going to focus on that process of how we identify, match to an evidence-based practice, and then monitor the effectiveness of those interventions and make decisions afterwards, as you see in some of the other team responsibilities. And I want to mention 8 because someone on that team, usually in that group that knows Tier 3 and knows Tier 1, there is someone on your campus that knows your legal and ethical guidelines for your district when we're talking about providing supplemental supports to students. And our district coordinators are often well-versed in that as well, but we want your local expert there if all possible on your campus, the person you go to and ask those questions when needed. For team roles, these aren't necessarily people except for that first one, but we are, from all the field and what makes Tier 2 successful, we know there's some essential team roles that need to be present. So we talked a little bit about that subset of Tier 1 connecting to Tier 2 and Tier 3. Here, we know, as usual, our administrator is a make or break. If we don't have an administrator present in this training and within this team, then we won't have the responsibility or the level of decision making that we need for things like scheduling for supplemental instructional time, FTE or scheduling time for staff to deliver interventions, or even sometimes things like purchasing if we need to purchase materials for a certain intervention. So there, as usual, are our make or break member that we want to have present. The other roles can be fulfilled by several different staff members at your school, depending on your school makeup. So if you're elementary or secondary, it may be different. But I already talked about the subset piece, and that's important, the link between your various tiers for communication. It really helps if for example, a dean is on a tier 2 team and they know exactly what's happening with tier 1 problem solving in your school-wide framework. Along with possibly that dean knows who's referred for individual problem solving, and I'm using dean as an example. It could be other staff members that you have, but they know what's happening across all tiers. And then that content knowledge. We want someone who knows what is an evidence-based intervention for social and emotional behavioral needs. We're going to be going through a lot of tools and resources to help your team with this, but you want your person here, just like we want like a literacy coach or instructional coach present to support staff or support teams in those content areas of literacy. We want your staff members that have some of this content knowledge to be present for this training. And I already mentioned the legal ethical piece. And then along with that, who is your data guru? So you want your data guru who knows how to access various reports. A lot of times that's my administrators or my deans, but it could be other staff or roles on your campuses, but whoever knows how to access data, knows some of your process and procedures for a multi-tiered system in the district where you're looking at screening data or diagnostic data, inform what intervention, functional sources of information on behavior function, and then how we track progress monitoring data. So you want that data guru here. So like our picture says, these are our members or roles that we need to make sure are present. Now that doesn't necessarily mean a lot of people. So in this training, it's a smaller group. It's not like in tier 1 training where you brought a 6 to 8 group of folks. This usually is a smaller little subset. But those are some of the critical things to think about. And if you have further questions, feel free to ask your district coordinators. So that's why in your readiness checklist, we ask you to kind of think about and prompt who's coming and what are their responsibilities. We've taken some of those crucial roles that I just mentioned and responsibilities that make these teams successful, and we've asked you to think about and identify it as part of readiness. I talked a little bit about tier 2 and the critical features of it, but here's a really nice outline of things we're going to go through in the training. I keep mentioning it's going to build off or supplement your tier 1, so we know it's going to build off that instruction of your school-wide expectations that are part of your tier 1 framework. And I keep mentioning we're going to look systemically at how to use data as a screener to identify students and possibly diagnostic data to match to common groupings. So when we look at implementing supports, it's going to be grouping kids by similar skill needs or function-based groupings to help you be more successful with the resources you have. We also want to make sure that these supports begin as quickly as possible. Usually the guidance is around 30 days after referral. Some of the other bullets that you see come back to that data guru role that you need. But again, we'll be reviewing some of this content with you if these don't sound familiar as far as features of your system. And it's why we want some of those roles of the team there that we talked about. We'll also mention the communication. So we always want to build awareness of what's happening with our tier 2 supports, just like we mentioned in tier 1 with our staff, students, and our caregivers and families. So as a starting point, another piece you'll see in the readiness checklist is we want you to be able in the training to evaluate how strong or are there cracks in our tier 1 foundation or school-wide PBIS framework. We want to be able to improve those if there are cracks, or we know we're going to build on that if it's already super strong. And to do that, we ask you to bring sources of information. So this is the piece of the readiness checklist that we point out we'd like to see teams bring their BOQ total score, which kind of indicates them at a strong level of fidelity of tier 1, or I might have some areas I need to work on to those cracks we just talked about to work on tier 1. Or if it's a spring or fall time of year, you might be looking at your PBIS implementation checklist score. And that tool functions a little differently. So we ask you to add up the first 20 items of that pick to get your kind of, am I solid, or an indicator that I might have some cracks there. And here's a visual of those because they do look a little different in our new system. At the top is the benchmarks of quality report. And if you sign into the PBS ES data system with your user and password on the implementation tab, you can see your total score across time. And of course, if you're coming to training, as an example, over the summer or right now, across June or July, then you would be looking at your previous year total score for that readiness checklist. 70 is usually that threshold of pretty strong foundational fidelity. So of course, this particular example, they have a pretty strong total score as their historical last year. The pick is at the bottom. The pick looks a little different as far as having to add those items up. So if you go in your history tab at the top to school data and your most recent pick, that will most likely be your fall pick, even though I know here is a spring pick. The fall is done around, it's due by November 1st. You can add up your first a couple items, the 28 items on your readiness checklist, to get a total score that gives you an estimate of how your foundation is. So any questions about those past measures, please feel free, again, to reach out to your district coordinator if it's trouble accessing them or anything about those scores. But that's why we have you do that as part of readiness and pull those measures so you can look at them in terms of considering Tier 1 foundation. So we are, of course, going to want you to think about, before you come to training, while you're at training, we'll have some activities around this. What do you already have for behavioral and social emotional interventions on your campus? We gave you some samples, and those are just examples and samples on your readiness checklist there at the bottom, but thinking through some of what you already have. And so these are some of those same examples just on the slide, and these are only some. There could be lots of others, so please don't think these are the only ones you can have. But we will talk a lot about the behavior education program or check-in, check-out intervention program. That's a picture of the manual right there on the slide. So we'll talk about that one in training, but you might have some pieces of that already on your campus. The other three are examples of different curriculums you might have as part of social skill or social emotional skill groups. So those are some pretty popular ones that have a pretty strong evidence base in them that we hear a lot from schools or districts. You might also have some other ones. So feel free to think if they're not, again, these are examples. So if you have other curriculums that you know are used for small group instruction, please bring them, bring resources that you have on the campus so that you can use those during playing time in the training. The other one we bring up in Tier 2 is some of those groups that might form throughout the year based on various needs or support groups that might be functioning. So those things like grief groups, or another one I've heard is divorce groups, like for lots of kids who are going through divorce or that life change. Those types of support groups we want to think through too. Often we'll have members of the team present in this training that know a lot about those groups or even implement those groups. So that's very helpful for team planning time. And the last is very broad, but we just mentioned classroom level interventions. Sometimes on campuses, we have classrooms that are doing their own form of supplemental instruction with kids, or they form groups within their classroom level where they're doing more instruction on behavioral expectations. So we left that broad, and if you have some source of that going on in your classrooms on your campus, you can feel free to note that, brainstorm that with your team, because you could build on that, or we'll be able to evaluate how those are working for you during training. So those are some examples. Please brainstorm with your team. That's why we put that little section of the readiness checklist there. And last but not least, we just have you sign off as the key point of contact that you feel you're ready for training. So often your district coordinators will share these and then prompt you with a date they need to be returned to them. And that's so us as trainers from Florida PBS Project can, one, review them and get ideas of the teams that are coming to training to gear that content for you. But as I just reviewed through, also just make you prepared for success in the training. So if you go through these checklist elements and considerations before training, you will get the most benefit out of that Tier 2 systems training with our team. This is our contact information for you. And again, feel free to reach out through your district coordinator if there are questions or concerns. And we are looking forward to having you in training.